David Harper, a former FBI agent, thought his life was under control until he discovered his wife Claire was having an affair with Andrew Miller, a charming businessman with dangerous secrets. What followed would shatter their world and lead to a deadly confrontation that no one could have predicted. But in a twist no one saw coming, the murders David committed were just the beginning of a far more twisted tale. One where death wasn't the end, but the spark that ignited a far-reaching criminal conspiracy. David Harper had always been a man of discipline and control. A former FBI agent with a brilliant career, he was respected for his sharp mind and unwavering commitment to justice. His life had once been full of purpose, his days dictated by the structured routine of federal investigations, where every case was a puzzle and every solution brought satisfaction. He had a beautiful family, a devoted wife, Claire, and 2 young children, Lucas and Emma. And they lived in a picturesque home in suburban Virginia, a place where neighbors knew each other by name, and everything appeared peaceful. However, as time went on, David's life began to feel like an endless cycle. A sudden injury had forced him to retire from the FBI, and the transition had been harder than he expected. Without the rush of cases and the sense of mission that came with his job, he felt adrift. His days, once filled with action and purpose, now seemed monotonous. But it wasn't just the loss of his career that troubled him. It was the growing distance between him and Claire. At first, the changes in her behavior were subtle. She was no longer as attentive as she used to be, her smiles seemed forced, and there was a new coldness in her eyes. David, who had always trusted her implicitly, started to feel like a stranger in his own home. Late nights at the office turned into late nights out, but Claire's explanations felt increasingly hollow. She would say she was working late or attending a book club meeting, but something about her stories never quite added up. Her once open and warm demeanor had become guarded, and David couldn't help but feel that she was hiding something. The tipping point came when he noticed Claire's phone habits. She had always been an open book with him, allowing him to read through her texts, knowing there were no secrets between them. But now, she would hide her phone screen when he walked into the room, and she was careful to turn it face down whenever she set it on the kitchen counter. One evening, David walked into the kitchen to find her texting someone, with urgency in her eyes. She quickly locked the phone and gave him a forced smile, but it was enough. David's suspicion turned into obsession. Who was she texting? Why the secrecy? A sense of betrayal gnawed at him, and David's mind began to race. What was she doing behind his back? Unable to live with the uncertainty, David decided to confront the situation head-on. He started going through her phone when she wasn't looking, and it didn't take long for him to find the evidence he feared. There it was, plain as day. Messages between Claire and a man named Andrew Miller, a name David had never heard before. The tone of the conversations was intimate, filled with terms of endearment and plans to meet up in secret. David's heart sank as he read the messages over and over, each word twisting the knife deeper. Claire, the woman he had married, the mother of his children, was having an affair. David's initial shock turned to anger. He couldn't believe the woman he trusted with everything had been keeping such a monumental secret from him. But more than anger, he felt humiliated, betrayed. The perfect life he had built, his career, his family, seemed to crumble in an instant. What did this man offer that he couldn't? Was it a lapse in judgment, or had their entire relationship been a lie? As the days went by, David couldn't shake the images of Claire with Andrew, imagining them together in ways that made him feel like an outsider in his own home. The betrayal began to consume him. He had always prided himself on his ability to solve problems, to see things clearly. But this was beyond him. And soon, the anger started to burn hotter. The more he thought about it, the less he could let go of the rage building inside him. Claire had crossed a line, and in his mind there was only one way to end it. The moment of truth was coming, and David knew he would have to face it head-on. David couldn't sleep. The weight of his discovery, Claire's affair with Andrew Miller, loomed over him like a dark cloud, suffocating every thought. He replayed the scenes in his mind, each moment growing more distorted as his anger festered. He knew he had to confront her. There could be no more hiding, no more pretending that everything was fine. The trust between them was shattered, and no matter how much he tried to rationalize it, he couldn't escape the growing need to know everything. What? He reluctantly called David to face the truth head-on. Claire had always been the love of his life. They'd built a family together, shared dreams and aspirations, and spent years trusting one another. But now, All of that seemed to unravel in a matter of days. The affair wasn't just a betrayal of their marriage. It felt like a betrayal of everything he had ever known about her. And Andrew Miller, the man who had wormed his way into their lives, someone David didn't even recognize, had crossed a line he wasn't willing to forgive. David's mind raced as he waited for the right moment. He followed Claire's movements carefully, tracking her comings and goings until he knew exactly where she would be on that fateful night. Claire had mentioned she was meeting Andrew again, something about a business dinner. David didn't buy it. His gut told him it was the perfect opportunity to confront them both. He had to end this, even if it meant losing everything. The apartment was only a few miles away, but it felt like an eternity as David's hands gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He had never felt more alive, and yet, more dead inside. He wasn't sure if he was walking toward a confrontation with Claire or toward his own destruction. He had already imagined every possible outcome, each scenario a violent battle for the soul of his family. But what could he do? What choice did he have but to confront them, to demand answers, to take back some semblance of control over the chaos consuming his life? As David pulled into the parking lot, the chill of the night seemed to settle into his bones. He spotted Claire's car, parked just outside the door to Andrew's apartment. His heart pounded in his chest, a rhythmic beat that matched his rapid thoughts. He was here now, and there was no turning back. David didn't knock. He didn't announce himself. He simply walked in. The door to Andrew's apartment was slightly ajar, and as David pushed it open, he saw them. Claire sitting on the couch, Andrew leaning in close. The sight of them together, so intimate, sent a jolt of fury through David's veins. He felt his body tense, the muscles in his arms tightening as though preparing for a battle. Andrew was the first to notice him. His expression changed from one of casual comfort to one of sheer shock. Claire turned around too, her face pale as her eyes locked with David's. For a brief moment, time seemed to stop. David's breath caught in his throat as he stood frozen in the doorway, a mixture of disbelief and rage coursing through him. Claire opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Andrew stood up quickly, a defensive posture taking shape as he moved to put himself between Claire and David. It was too late. David's fury had already erupted, and in a flash the confrontation turned violent. There were no words, no explanations, just actions driven by pure emotion. The gun, which David had carried for protection during his years as an FBI agent, was now an instrument of revenge. He had never imagined using it like this, never imagined being capable of such violence. But as the gunshot rang out, echoing in the small apartment, it felt like everything that had been building inside him had finally been released. Andrew crumpled to the floor, his blood staining the carpet beneath him. David's eyes shifted toward Claire, who had stumbled back, her hand over her mouth in shock. The betrayal was written all over her face, but there was no turning back now. David's hands were shaking as he approached her, his mind a blur of confusion and rage. He had come for answers, for justice, but now all he could see was the woman who had broken him. In a moment of cold, calculated finality, he did the unthinkable. Claire fell to the floor beside Andrew, her body lifeless, and David stood over them, the weight of what he had just done crashing over him. The adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a deep, suffocating emptiness. He had killed them both. And in that moment, David knew that nothing would ever be the same again. His life had just been reduced to a single, irreversible act of violence, and there would be no way to undo it. What had started as a quest for truth had spiraled into something far darker than he could have ever imagined. David stood motionless in the apartment, the weight of what he had just done sinking in. The air around him felt thick, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Claire and Andrew were dead. His wife, the woman he had once loved, and the man who had stolen her from him. He had imagined this moment countless times in the dark corners of his mind. But nothing could have prepared him for the cold, hollow emptiness that followed. He quickly snapped into action, his training as an FBI agent kicking in. Panic was not an option. He knew the rules, the procedures, the things he needed to do to make sure no one could trace this back to him. It had to look like an accident, a botched robbery, something that wouldn't raise any immediate suspicion. David moved quickly through the apartment, wiping his fingerprints from every surface. The gun was still in his hand, and he made sure to clean it carefully as though the weapon itself could expose him. He placed it beside Andrew's body, making it look like a struggle. The scene had to be convincing. He rummaged through the apartment, taking a few small valuables to make it look like a robbery gone wrong. Things that could be easily explained away. He opened the windows, scattering a few items on the floor, making sure everything seemed as chaotic as possible. Once he was sure everything appeared plausible, David took a step back and surveyed the scene. It looked just right. The door was slightly ajar, as if it had been forced open. The broken lamp on the floor and the overturned furniture made it look like there had been a fight. The blood, now darkening the carpet beneath them, would convince anyone that this was just another senseless act of violence in a dangerous world. With a final glance at the bodies, David turned and left the apartment. He moved with calculated steps, not allowing himself to pause, to think, to second-guess. As he entered his car and pulled out of the parking lot, the cold night air seemed to clear his head. His heart was still racing, but his mind was calm, focused. He had done it. No one would suspect him. Back at home, David returned to his family. The children were asleep, blissfully unaware of the violence that had just unfolded only miles away. He forced himself to slip into his role as the grieving husband, the devastated father. Claire's absence was unbearable, but he had to hide his guilt. No one could know the truth, not even his own children. The police investigation began soon after. Detectives arrived at the crime scene the following morning, and their initial impressions leaned toward a robbery. There were signs of forced entry, items missing from the apartment, and no immediate suspects. David watched from the sidelines, playing the concerned spouse, acting as if he was just as devastated as the rest of the world. He gave his statement to the police, pretending he had no idea who would want to hurt Claire or Andrew. He showed up at the funeral, solemn and grieving, just like everyone expected. Months passed, and the case grew cold. The police found no solid leads, and the trail went silent. David breathed a sigh of relief each time he heard the news of another dead end. Each time they seemed further from uncovering the truth. He had gotten away with it. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to feel like everything was back to normal, like nothing had changed. But deep down, he knew it wasn't over. The guilt still gnawed at him, the memories of that night haunting his dreams. He couldn't forget, but as far as the world was concerned, David Harper had buried his past. Or so he thought. Months turned into years, and David Harper had managed to maintain the illusion of normalcy. The police investigation had stalled, and the case had slipped into cold storage, forgotten by most. To the outside world, he was just another widower, a man who had tragically lost his wife and the father of his children. Life continued, as it always did. He moved to a new city, assumed a new identity, and started fresh. Or so he thought. But the past never truly lets go. Though the police had moved on, there was one nagging detail that David couldn't shake. He knew that, sooner or later, someone would connect the dots. He had been too careful, too meticulous, but the memory of that night, the sound of the gunshots, the sight of their bodies, it haunted him. The guilt festered beneath the surface, growing worse with each passing day. He couldn't outrun it, he couldn't forget. Then, the unthinkable happened. A new lead surfaced. It wasn't much, just a small piece of evidence that had been overlooked in the initial investigation, but it was enough to set things in motion again. A gas station security camera had captured a figure, clearly resembling David, parked near Andrew Miller's apartment the night of the murders. The footage wasn't clear enough to definitively identify him, but it was enough to raise questions, enough to make the authorities start looking in his direction once more. David had been living under the radar for years, but this new revelation put everything at risk. He wasn't sure how the police had connected the dots, or if it was just a stroke of luck, but he knew one thing for sure. The walls were closing in. His heart pounded every time he saw a police car on the street or heard a siren in the distance. He had been so careful, so calculated in his efforts to hide, but now his past was threatening to catch up with him. He couldn't afford to get complacent. The authorities were narrowing their focus, and soon they would find out who he really was. David didn't wait for the inevitable. He knew what needed to be done. The life he had built in the quiet town was about to collapse. He had to disappear again, this time for good. He packed his things in a hurried frenzy, leaving behind the life he had spent so many years trying to build. He couldn't afford to take chances. One misstep could bring everything crashing down. He used the last of his savings to pay for a new identity, A new life far from the watchful eyes of the police. David Harper, the former FBI agent, was gone. In his place was a man with no past, no history, someone who could vanish without a trace. He headed west, into a world where no one knew him and no one would ever ask questions. But even in the anonymity of a new town, the guilt never stopped. It was like a shadow, following him wherever he went. No matter how many miles he put between himself and that fateful night, he couldn't escape the feeling that the clock was ticking. David had thought he was in the clear, but he knew deep down that the truth always had a way of coming to light, no matter how long it took. It was only a matter of time before his past caught up with him. David was no longer just running from the police. He was running from himself. David had thought he had outrun his past, but he was wrong. The fear of being caught never fully subsided, and the guilt gnawed at him every waking moment. It was as though he could never fully escape the weight of what he had done. No matter how far he ran or how deep he buried himself in his new identity, he always felt a sense of impending doom, a creeping certainty that his past would find him. One fateful morning, the nightmare David had tried to outrun finally found its way to his door. A knock on his new apartment door startled him awake. His pulse quickened as he stood frozen in the middle of the room, heart pounding. He had lived so carefully, so quietly. He had been cautious, never staying too long in one place, never allowing himself to get too close to anyone. Yet here it was, the moment he had feared, the moment that would unravel everything. David hesitated for a moment, fear gripping him. The knock came again, more urgent this time. He slowly approached the door, his hand shaking as he turned the handle. Standing on the other side was a woman, mid-30s, with dark hair and piercing eyes. Her expression was one of determination, and something about her demeanor immediately set off alarms in David's mind. "I'm looking for David Harper," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I need to ask you a few questions." David's stomach dropped. His real name. How could she know? Panic flared within him, but he forced himself to maintain composure. "I think you have the wrong person," he replied, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside. The woman didn't flinch. "I don't think so. You used to be an FBI agent, didn't you? David Harper?" David's mind raced. How had she connected him? Was she with the police? A private investigator? He had been so careful, so meticulous in covering his tracks. But somewhere, someone had found him. Someone had dug deep enough to reveal the truth. "I don't know what you're talking about," David stammered, trying to maintain control, but his heart was pounding in his ears. The fear was overwhelming now, threatening to consume him. The woman didn't buy it. She stepped forward, pushing past him into the apartment without waiting for an invitation. "I think you know exactly what I'm talking about," she said, her voice unwavering. "I'm not here to arrest you, not yet, but I'm going to find out the truth. I'm Zoe Martin. I'm Claire's best friend." The name hit David like a sledgehammer. Zoe Martin. The woman who had been Claire's closest confidant. The one who had stayed in touch with her after the marriage had started to unravel. The woman who, he had once assumed, was just another person in their life. But now, standing in his apartment, she was the one who had come to finish the puzzle. David's blood ran cold. She knew too much. She knew everything. Zoe explained how she had never believed the official narrative of Claire's death. Something didn't add up in the investigation, and she had spent years searching for answers. She had gathered pieces of information, followed small leads, and now she was standing here, inches from the truth. David had assumed he had buried his past deep enough, but Zoe had managed to pull him out of the shadows. Zoe's presence in his life was like a virus, a threat he hadn't anticipated. Her relentless pursuit had cracked open the shell of safety he had built. The walls were closing in on him faster than he could react. The woman who had been close to Claire, who had known all the details of their lives, was now the key to unraveling everything he had worked so hard to hide. David tried to maintain his composure, but the weight of his actions was too heavy to carry any longer. His mind, once sharp and calculated, now felt sluggish. He had lived in fear for so long, and now that fear was finally coming to fruition. Zoe wasn't going to stop. She would never rest until she uncovered the truth, and David knew that in the end, his past would catch up with him. Zoe, sensing the shift in David, took a step closer. You can run all you want, David, but you can't hide forever. You're going to face the consequences of your actions. David stared at her, his world crumbling around him. The past had finally caught up, and there was nowhere left to run. The truth was coming out, whether he was ready or not.